Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is my January reading wrap up. I'm so glad that you are all here. And when I went to edit this video, I'm currently editing it right now, I realized that the majority of the video has terrible sound quality. I don't know what happened. I never have issues filming on my phone, and for some reason the sound quality is just terrible. I do not have the motivation to refilm the entire wrap up, so we're just gonna go with it. You may just have to turn up the volume a little bit for the majority of the video, but I can still be heard. That's the important part. I just apologize if the sound quality is bothersome, but again, I do not have the time or energy to refilm. But it is my January wrap up. It'll be all the books I read in January, and I would love to know what some of the books you read were, what are the highlights of January for you. So without further ado, we'll move on to the video. And again, I apologize for the terrible sound quality. Right at the end, the sound comes back on, but there was actually no sound when I filmed the introduction to the video. So no sound, and then the majority of the video was terrible sound, and then at the very end, it decided to work again. I don't know what was going on, but we're just gonna go with it. But thank you all for being here, and we're just gonna go on to the wrap up. January was a bit of a challenging month for me in various different ways, just with my health and work and a whole bunch of things were going on. It felt like the longest month of my life, but we're now in February, and I'm hopeful that the year will bring new joys and better things, but January was challenging, and that's one of the reasons why BookTube kind of just fell on the back burner. I was just not able to film. I didn't have the energy. I have been dealing with a lot of mental fog that has to do with my health, and I'm not going to get into it. It's just a whole other can of worms, and we're here to talk about books. But I had meant to just take a couple weeks off after Bookmas. I filmed a lot in December, and I had mentioned that the first couple weeks of January I would kind of take as a break, but it ended up being the entire month. I don't have any regrets with that. I really needed the break, but I'm really glad to be back and hope to have many videos coming out over the next few months and over the next year. And obviously I have to prioritize my health and other things in life, but BookTube is a joy, and I just love making videos, and I love being part of this community. One of my favorite things about BookTube is just talking to you all in the comments. It just makes me so happy when I see so many comments, and I love being able to relate with all of you on what we're reading, and even if we have differing perspectives on the books that we're reading, it's just so fun and really such a blessing to be part of this community. That was a rambly intro. We're gonna get into what I read in January, and I would also love to know what you read in January, what some of the highlights of the month were for you as well. Because of my reading slump, I kind of started off the month not the strongest. I had started a few books in December with the goal of reading as much as I possibly can in January, especially because I was co-hosting a readathon called Epistolary January, and I am by far one of the worst co-hosts to exist. I filmed nothing. I didn't upload any kind of content for this readathon. I was a silent participant more than a co-host, and I'm just so sad about that, but I did read some wonderful epistolary fiction, and I will have all the other hosts linked in the description box just for you to go and see what they uploaded throughout the readathon and see what books they read for this readathon. Epistolary fiction is one of my favorite forms of fiction. I love journal entries and letters, and I'm glad that there was a month dedicated to reading this type of fiction, and I'm really hopeful that this will become a yearly thing every January. But like I was saying, because of the slump, I struggled the first couple of weeks to find my footing with what I was reading. I DNF'd a lot, and I'm not going to go over all the books that I DNF'd. There is one or two books I believe that are permanent DNFs. They are just not the books for me, and I will talk about them. So no major duds, but just a bit of a struggle to really get into reading until the latter half of the month, and I have a lot of 4-star reads. I'm really happy with that. I believe I have one or two books that were definitely the highlight of the month, and I finished them at the end of January, and I'm so excited to talk about them as well. So grab yourselves a comforting beverage, make yourselves cozy, and let's talk about everything I read in January. I will go over some reading statistics first, just because I want to include more stats in my wrap-ups. I really enjoy stats. I just never really shared them when I talk about what I read each month. But we'll just kind of go over a genre breakdown. So I technically read 5 classics. 4 of them were classics, and then 1 was a longer narrative poem. And I read 1 contemporary mystery, one middle grade fantasy, a YA fantasy, or is it adult? I'm not quite sure, but another fantasy, 2 historical fiction novels, and then I guess 1 nonfiction that could be classified as nonfiction. It's more of like a memoir biography type of story. It's a small collection of letters between people, so I don't really know how else to classify it. As I usually do, I'll start off with the books that I DNF'd, then quickly go over what I'm currently reading or carryovers from January into February, and then I'll go over what I read for Epistolary January, and then go over any books that I read that were not part of the readathon. So I was gonna go with natural lighting, but it's getting really dark and cloudy out, so we're just gonna do a little switcheroo and turn on the ring light. Just give me 1 second. Alrighty, hopefully the lighting is better. It was getting really dark out, and it was so sunny this morning, and the sun is now gone. So here we are. But we're first gonna go over the books that I DNF'd, and this first one, I still don't really know if I will come back to it at any point, but I had started it with the intention of reading it for Epistolary January, and I was not able to fully enjoy it, and that is the Journals of Ella Montgomery. It's the first volume out of a longer series of volumes. I don't know how many there are, but this one is the first collection, and they are her journal entries from when she was a young teenager up until I believe her early or young adulthood. Some of the entries that I read were just so heartwarming, and I could see her fictional characters in her own character. I could see Anne and bits of Emily Bird Starr and other characters that she wrote in Ella Montgomery, and I really enjoyed that. But a lot of the journal entries were just so mundane, and that's the thing with these types of collections, is you're going to get some really interesting journal entries, and you'll get some that are more, I guess, just the ordinary daily things in life. And it's not to say that they're not interesting, but I think because I was in such a huge slump, it was really contributing to it, and I decided to put it down. I don't know if I'll pick it back up, but out of the entries that I did read, I did find some really sweet moments, and it was really fun to see how strong of a personality Ella Montgomery had, and she definitely had her firecracker moments as a teenager, and I really enjoyed that. But I just don't know if it's the type of book that I want to read in full. I also tried reading The Visits of Elizabeth by, I believe the author is Eleanor Glynn, and this I tried for Epistolary January as well. It is a book that was published in 1900, so just at the end of the Victorian era, and it is just a collection of letters of a young 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth as she's writing to her mother. She's visiting various family members, and it seems from the get-go that this is kind of her mother's way of introducing Elizabeth to society and seeing if she can snatch an eligible bachelor and that kind of thing. So it's just Elizabeth's experience visiting different family members within England. I think she goes to France, and she meets this dashing, charming man who she kind of hates but is attracted to at the same time, and it's so silly. There were definitely some really funny moments, and moments where Elizabeth was just so naive and clueless and innocent, and the adults around her were kind of, they understood situations in a way that she didn't, and it was a bit of a surprising read, but it also was contributing to my reading slump, and the things that Elizabeth experiences and gets up to, they just became very repetitive. Like the same plot points were just being recycled, and she goes and visits one family, the same things happen there. She goes and visits another set of relatives, and more of the sameness, and she was quite exasperating as well, and I just was not enjoying my time once I started getting closer to the halfway point. So I decided it was time to set this aside. And then I also tried to read Shadowfell by Juliette Marillier. This, I believe, was on my winter pile of possibilities. I have had this for a long time, and I'm trying to work my way through my physical TBR as well, so this was next on my list of books to read. And it's one of those stories, it's YA, and just the summary, it says, for Naren, Shadowfell's existence is her only hope. She's penniless, orphaned, and utterly alone, and concealing a treacherous magical power that will warrant her immediate enslavement should it be revealed. She finds hope of allies in the good folk, fey beings whom she must pretend she cannot see and who taunt her with chatter of prophecies and tests, in a striking, mysterious stranger who saves her from certain death, but whose motives remain unclear. She knows she shouldn't trust anyone with her plans, but something within her longs to confide in him. Will Naren be forced to make the dangerous journey alone? She must reach Shadowfell not only to avenge her family and salvage her own life, but rescue Albin itself. Albin being the setting, or it's, I guess, like England. It's one of those YA fantasy stories where the plotline is very predictable, and our main character is a carbon copy of many many YA main characters. And I believe it was also in first person. Yes, it is in first person. I believe I read about 50 pages, and if you enjoy stories where there's like this quest that characters are going on and one of them has to hide certain aspects of their personality and that kind of thing, and like the powers they have and everything, you may enjoy that. This was just not the book for me. I'll quickly mention the books that I'm currently reading, and they are carryovers from December and January. First up is Middlemarch by George Eliot, and this one my goal was to finish the first book within this story, which is Miss Brooke, and I'm only halfway through, so I was supposed to have finished that over December and January and didn't get a chance to, so I'll try to catch up in February. Just with the reading slump I was in, I didn't want to force myself to read this when I wasn't in the mood. Alongside Middlemarch, I have been reading Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads from 1798 and 1802, and I had seen multiple recommendations to read this collection alongside Middlemarch, as apparently George Eliot was very much influenced by these two poets and the Romantic period and everything like that. So I started one of the poems in here, and I'm taking my time with this one. I want to savor every single word, and with poetry, I'll have moments where, like, I'll have a week where all I want to read is poetry, and I'll just read poetry, and then the rest of the month I don't even want to see it. My mood is so variable with this, and when I started this, I was just so enamored. I started off the first poem, which is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in 7 parts. And as you can see, I was really, really, really into it and really enjoying it. And then my mood just completely shifted, and I just could not bring myself to pick this up anymore. But I am excited to pick it up once I'm in the mood for some poetry, but that is going to be read also slowly throughout the rest of this year. This next book is one that I've been working on for months, and the goal is also to finish it at the end of the year, and that is Alfred Tennyson, The Major Works. And I will actually come back to this later in the video, as I completed one of his long narrative poems. But I, besides that long narrative poem, read a few other just kind of random shorter poems from here, and even though I have not read very much poetry, I'm not well read in poetry at all, he will remain a favorite poet. He is amazing. His words are incredible, and they speak to my soul, and I just love his poetry so much. And it all started with Anne of Green Gables reading The Lady of Shalott in the 80s miniseries. That is what really started my interest in Tennyson and his works, but I never really took that any further. I knew of The Lady of Shalott and loved seeing paintings of The Lady of Shalott, and yeah, I am just so sad that it took me this long to start reading Tennyson, and he's amazing. So this will be another project to finish this year. Next, we will go over all the books I read for Epistolary January, and I'll just quickly mention the prompts for this readathon. So we have Love Letters, which is an epistolary romance. Then we have Lost Mail, a classic or book written by an author who's no longer with us. Free Shipping, so a book that was free. Correspondence, a book featuring letters between people, fiction or real letters. Airmail, a book set in a foreign country. Package, a book longer than 400 pages. Journal, a book with journal entries. And then Email, a contemporary book with text and or email. I am very glad to say that I was able to accomplish each challenge. I did read books that covered all of these prompts, and I'm very, very happy with that. I think for the epistolary fiction, I'll just go in the order of enjoyment, or like rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. None of these were duds though. I enjoyed every single book that I read for this readathon, and I'm very, very happy about that. So the first book is Things We Didn't Say by Amy Lynn Green, and this book I gave, I think, a 3.75 out of 5 stars. It was a really, really great read. It's historical fiction, completely epistolary. The entire book is told through letters and some newspaper articles, and basically we have this woman named Johanna, and she's a linguistics student at the university in, I think, Minnesota. And because of her talent in linguistics and languages and everything, she is asked to work in a German prisoner of war camp as a translator in her home state. And so she goes home, she starts this job, and she translates. She's also censoring a lot of the letters that are going between the German prisoners of war and their family back in Germany. It was really interesting to see how Johanna really started to sympathize with a lot of these prisoners and see them as human beings and see their humanity more than their status as German prisoners and basically criminals. This was World War II. I think I forgot to mention that. It's set during World War II. A lot of the people in her city are not very happy with the fact that she's working there and are just unhappy in general that they have German prisoners so close to their loved ones. And she's really dedicated to her work in the midst of all of that. And she's also writing letters to a university friend, Peter, who is a Japanese American. And he was actually in a Japanese American internment camp, as a lot of Japanese Americans were sent to these camps during World War II, just with Japan being part of the Axis powers. So that was a really interesting element to the story. And their friendship really starts to develop into something maybe more. It was not the center of the story, in my opinion, though, at all. This is not really a romance read. And I actually really liked that. It's more about Johanna's growth. The main thing going on in the story is Johanna, at the beginning, we learn that she is basically charged with treason against the American government. And so all of these letters and these different elements are part of a court case. And so we're kind of reading them with, I think, some like a lawyer or something. At the beginning of the story, we're told, you know, these letters and all these documents are part of her case. And so that was a really interesting element and really gripping, and I really enjoyed that. I really appreciated how the author, she really went deep with exploring these topics, these really difficult topics that have to do with war. With these types of stories, it's usually Germans are the bad people and the Americans, the Brits, the French, etc. are the good people, and, you know, Germans and the Nazis. Of course, the Nazis, it was very clear in the story, there's nothing good about being a Nazi at all. There was no excusing of war crimes and all of that, but the author really dug deep into what it means to be human, and regardless of what side of a war you are on, you are human at your core. You have the same fears, and, you know, you have loved ones at home that are worried about you, and I think she did a good job. It's not an easy type of story to tell. One of the reasons I didn't give this a higher rating was just the main character, Johanna. I really struggled to connect to her. I found her quite standoffish and often inappropriately sarcastic at times, and she did experience some character growth and definitely matured and everything. And one thing that I'm not sure how I felt about it, the spiritual elements of the story and the faith elements. Throughout the majority of the story, Johanna is very bitter towards God and the church, and at the end of the story she just kind of has this moment, and it's like the flip of a switch, and she's like, well, I guess, you know, God is good after all. Just kind of that really quick coming to realize whatever. It didn't feel genuine, if that makes sense, just to me personally, and my own experiences, my own spiritual walk with God and all of that. So I just wasn't sure how I felt about that. It also struggled a bit with the pacing of the story, but still a really great historical fiction read, and I would recommend. This book, I completely forgot to mention, also covered 4 different prompts. It covered free shipping as I read a library copy, correspondence, there were letters between characters, airmail, it is set in America, which is a foreign country from where I am. I'm in Canada. And then package, it is longer than 400 pages. So that book covered 4 prompts. This next book is one that is very, very beloved, and a lot of people, this is an all-time favorite book. They give it 5 stars. It didn't quite hit that mark for me, but I still really did enjoy it, and that is Daddy Longlegs by Jean Webster. This book I used to cover Lost Mail, or a book written by an author who's no longer with us, as the author is no longer with us. And it technically could be classed as a romance as well, but it's not really. It's hard to explain without spoiling the story, but anyways, this book is about Judy, who has grown up in an orphanage her entire life, and one day she's told that her writing has caught the attention of one of the trustees of the orphanage, and he offers to send her to college and basically pay for everything for her as she goes through college, with the stipulations that she needs to write to this trustee and cannot know his identity. So those are the 2 requirements that he puts before her, and she takes him up on the offer. And so Judy goes to college, and it's such a fun story just watching her experience college, and she definitely reminds me a little bit of Anne Shirley, a little bit of Emily Bird Starr. She really wants to be a writer. She has these big dreams for her academic life, and it's really interesting to see how her desires and her goals in life really evolve as she goes through college as well. This man, the benefactor that is paying for her college, she refers to him as Daddy Longlegs. I believe at some point she saw his shadow, and he looked like someone with very, very long legs, so hence Daddy Longlegs. That's what she calls him, and she's just writing letters to him. And I enjoyed it. I gave it 3.75 stars. What I do wish was that we got letters back from this man. I still don't understand why we didn't. Maybe the book wouldn't have been as charming if we got letters back from him. I can understand why, you know, this story is about Judy and her growth and her character development and her maturity and all of that. So it may have just kind of taken the lens off of her a little bit if we got his letters back, but I do wish we did. I also wasn't the biggest fan of Judy's stance on religion, and she made several statements that were very blunt and very, very negative, and it's just something that bothered me personally, but it is just a story and characters can have differing viewpoints. That's completely fine with me, but I just wasn't expecting that. It was a little off-putting. I will get into some very minor spoilers, and I'm not going to say any kind of major plot point to spoil the entire story, but just so you're aware, some very, very minor spoilers. But the man, Daddy Longlegs, at the very end of the story, we do learn who he is, and some people say that it felt like he was grooming Judy in a way. I don't necessarily see it that way, but I did feel a little bit creeped out, just a little bit, by this man. The issue is we don't understand his motivations from the get-go. We're never told, like, why Judy? Okay, you enjoyed her writing, you thought it was really, really good, so you decided to just send this random orphan off to college, and that's completely fine and dandy. It's the first female orphan as well. I believe he's done this with male students, but he's never sent a female orphan to college. But I just didn't really understand his motivations because she was, I think, 17 at the start, and he kind of witnesses her growth and development without her knowing who he is. And that was just a little unsettling. He's never really a prominent presence on page until the very end, and then when we're given that reveal of who he is, I just found it to be kind of like, oh, okay, moving on. Like, I don't know. The ending was a little bit anticlimactic, but at the same time, I thought it was sweet. So I had very, very opposite feelings that were kind of warring with each other as I finished this book. But just going back to Judy, I really love how she loves to learn, and just the number of references to books in this story was wonderful. She loves reading, and there were many references to authors like the Brontes. We get a lot of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. I believe there are even references to Tennyson and Little Women, and I really, really loved that. But yeah, a bit of a mixed bag, but overall enjoyable. Next up, I also read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but this book I have been meaning to read for a long time, and it's beloved. So many people have recommended it, and I'm really glad that I did read it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It is the beloved classic, a 20-year correspondence between an American writer and a British bookseller. So our author, Helene Hanff, she was a freelance writer living in New York City, and these letters began, I think, in the late 40s, just after the end of World War II, and then continued into the 60s. This also covered prompts 2 and 4. So Lost Mail, a book by an author who's no longer with us, and then 4, which is correspondence, letters between people. So those 2 prompts were covered by this book. And I actually also read this for Anne's Read the Classics challenge. So for January, and if you haven't heard of that challenge, I'll leave Anne's announcement video for it in the description box. Every single month of the year, there's a new prompt, and then there are scavenger hunt items within that prompt, and then a challenge. And I'm really, really happy to say that I completed the entire January challenge. So I accomplished the prompt, the 3 scavenger hunt items, and the challenge for the month. So the prompt was to read a book off of your physical TBR, and then the scavenger hunt items, I believe, were like a book on the cover or a book about books or something like that, a book that is wintery or has wintery writing or a wintry scene, and then a male protagonist. So this one is one book that I read for the challenge. I actually read 2. So this one was on my physical TBR and has books on the cover. And then for the other 2 scavenger hunt items, I accomplished those with another book, which I'll talk about later. And then the challenge for January was to not buy a single book. It is a book buying ban for the month of January, and I accomplished that, and I am so proud of myself for that. So that is the January challenge for Anne's Read the Classics. And again, her announcement for that challenge is in the description box. So like I was saying, I gave this one 4 stars. I overall really enjoyed it. The author, Helene Hanff, she was so full of wit and such a fun sense of humor, and I love how distinct her voice was from that of the main bookseller that she was corresponding with, and I completely forget his name. Frank Dole was his name, and just the way that he wrote, very, very professional, and all his letters were very professional until they got to know each other a little more. But Helene, from almost the get-go, was just so blunt and herself and just so fun. Just as an example, a letter that Helene sends to Frank, and in all caps, she's like, "What kind of a black Protestant Bible is this? Kindly inform the Church of England they have loused up the most beautiful prose ever written. Whoever told them to tinker with the Vulgate Latin? They'll burn for it, you mark my words. It's nothing to me. I'm Jewish myself, but I have a Catholic sister-in-law, a Methodist sister-in-law, a whole raft of Presbyterian cousins through my great-uncle Abraham who converted, and an aunt who's a Christian Science healer, and I like to think none of them would countenance this Anglican Latin Bible if they knew it existed. And as it happens, they don't know Latin existed." And then Frank's response is simply, "I am sorry we made the mistake with the Latin Bible, and we will try to find a Vulgate for you. Yours faithfully, Frank Dole." Just so funny, but he definitely does open up throughout the years, and we get letters from his wife as well, and other people that work at his bookstore, Marks & Co., and it was truly, truly so sweet. I didn't adore every single letter that I read. Not every single letter was one that I found to be super charming, and I also was not expecting Helene to be so anti-fiction for a lot of her letters. She was always on the lookout for something non-fiction, and I just wasn't expecting that until she reads Jane Austen. Then it's like, oh, fiction actually can be quite wonderful. So she realized that Jane Austen is a wonderful writer, which I really enjoyed seeing that. The sad thing is I don't believe Helene ever had a chance to meet Frank in person, which is quite sad, but she did eventually, I believe, go to England and visit this bookstore. Yeah, I don't know really what else to say. I thought it was really interesting. Another thing actually that I found interesting was just how long the rationing went on after the end of World War II within the UK. In America, things just kind of moved on. Of course, they were really far from the main action of World War II, but in the UK, the rationing went on for years and years and years, and Helene often would send eggs and meat and just help Frank and his co-workers and family and just send them things to kind of help them out, and I just thought that was really interesting. So that is 84 Charing Cross Road. I'm glad that I read it. Not an all-time favorite, but definitely enjoyable. Next up is Divine Arrivals by Rebecca Ross, and this one was a reread for me. I read it for the first time, I think in 2023, and I overall enjoyed my reread. The first time, I completely fell head over heels in love with this book, and the thing with rereads is sometimes I don't enjoy the book as much. I need to have a longer period between reads to fully enjoy my reread a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And with this one, I ended up giving it 4 stars upon this reread. I still enjoyed it. I don't know, I just didn't really love it the way that I did the first time I read it. But I reread it because I want to read Ruthless Vows very soon, and I did want to kind of refresh my memory on what goes on in this story, so I reread it for that reason. And also it counts for Epistolary January, as there are many letters between our characters. So this one does cover the first prompt of love letters, as it is a romance. It also covers 4 correspondence, letters between people, and then 5 airmail is kind of a stretch, but it is set in a fantasy world inspired by England, so it's set in a foreign country. It is not set in Canada, so it counts for me. So like I was saying, it is set in a fictional world that feels very much like England in like the 1910s. And we have 2 main characters, Iris and Roman, and they are both writers for this gazette, and they're kind of rivals, and they end up both being war correspondents in this war between gods. And the war feels very much like World War I, like the Great War. And so they visit basically where the battle is taking place and write about the war. And Iris's brother has gone missing as well in action, so she's trying to figure out where he is. And she realizes that she can send letters through her wardrobe, and they're sent to this mysterious person who then writes back. And so she's kind of corresponding, not realizing that it is Roman, who she's not the biggest fan of at the beginning of the story. And Roman writes back knowing it is Iris. She's just the only one who doesn't know. And so there are a lot of letters being passed between them magically, and they have these magical typewriters, and it's just a very, very magical story. And of course, it is a romance as well. So it is a really, really fun fantasy novel, and I'm very excited for Ruthless Vows. I will say there are things in this book that I don't like and that are just kind of off-putting. And the big one for me is there is an open door scene. It is a wedding night scene, and so I can appreciate it as a married couple, and it is not written in a smutty or crude way at all, but it is there, and I wanted to mention it. Normally something I definitely try to avoid. Definitely something that did bother me a little bit, but besides that, I did very much enjoy my reread. What I really like about this story is how it feels like historical fantasy. It feels like historical fiction with fantasy elements. I love Great War and World War II stories, so that is definitely a plus for me. And it also ends on a huge cliffhanger, so I'm very, very excited for Ruthless Vows. I remember the first time I finished this book, and I was just in despair, just thinking, oh my goodness, I have to wait so long for the second book. But now that I have it, I need to just start reading it, and yeah, that is Divine Rivals. Next up is a book that I really, really enjoyed. It was not at all what I was expecting. I went in with certain expectations that I soon realized would not be met because I had the wrong impressions of this book, but I so enjoyed it, and that is The Appeal by Janice Hallett. And this one I read for the 8th prompt, which is email, a contemporary story with text and or email. A lot of this story is told through emails, and basically what this story is about, we have these two lawyers at the very beginning who are given this document collection, and they're told to kind of read through everything and figure out what's going on. And so we as the reader kind of become like these lawyers sifting through evidence, trying to figure out what on earth is going on here. But basically, we're reading through all this correspondence between a variety of characters that are part of this theater group. And one day the director of this theater group, he sends an email to everyone in the group that his granddaughter has been diagnosed with this rare form of cancer, and they're trying to raise thousands and thousands of pounds. It's set in England, so thousands of pounds to basically buy this treatment that they can't get really any other way. It's from America. And so they start these fundraisers, and something just seems off about the whole thing, and there's a lot of tension between a lot of the cast members in this theater group. There's this couple who were nurses in Africa, and they show up in this, they join the theater group, and there's just something off about them, and just so many weird things are going on, and we're just kind of sifting through the evidence and trying to learn what exactly is happening. And then very, very far into the story, a murder occurs, and that is what I thought the story would be. I thought it would be a murder mystery from the get-go. It is definitely not. It's more of a mystery within a character study, or a character study within a mystery. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you're really learning about these characters, their motivations, what makes them tick, family dynamics. Like, it's very complex. This story is so unique. You're basically given this cast of characters, and they're all layered, and you have to peel back the layers of each and every single one of them to really understand what on earth is going on. It is so fun. I thought it was a page turner. I thought it was really, really captivating and gripping, even though it is not a fast-paced story. The majority of the time, I was just kind of sitting there with my eyebrows furrowed, like, what is going on? What am I reading? Why is this person such a terrible person? Why is this person so creepy? Where on earth is this money going that they're raising for this cancer treatment? And it was wild. I really enjoyed it. I also physically read this book while listening to the audiobook, and the audiobook has different narrators, both male and female. Highly recommend reading it that way. If you can get your hands on a physical copy and the audiobook, either like on Scribd or through your library, it's the best way to read this book. I promise. It just makes for a much better experience. But that is The Appeal by Janice Hallett. Definitely a really, really unique mystery, and one that I would probably reread in the future. I thought it was so fun. And the very last book that I read for Epistolary January, my favorite read for this readathon, fantastic, 5 stars. I adored this book, and that is The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon, Volume 3. Oh, I loved it so much. And this book is the only book that I read with journal entries, so it is the only book that accomplished the prompt to read a book with journal entries. If any of you are reading this series and you have yet to read Volume 3, just a warning, it does spoil Jane Eyre. Quite a huge plot point in Jane Eyre. So if you haven't read Jane Eyre and you are reading this series and you want to read Jane Eyre, just be aware that this will spoil Jane Eyre. The Emma M. Lyon series, it's nothing absolutely out of this world, like a literary masterpiece by any means, but it is pure fun. The type of series and the type of story where you're not supposed to take anything seriously. It is just a good time. It is such a good time and pure escapism, and for that type of story, it is perfection, in my opinion. I will say the first volume, I think I gave 4 stars. It wasn't my favorite, and it kind of lays a lot of the foundation for our character Emma and the rest of the series, but so far we're getting a deeper look into our main character Emma and her journey with grief, and we saw a little bit more of that in this story, and I really liked that. But like I was saying, the first book isn't really the deepest of stories. It's just laying the foundation for our main character, and all these stories are her journal entries and what she gets up to on a day-to-day. And basically, I haven't even said what the series is about. Emma M. Lyon returns to her London home. It is London, England, but a very interesting twist on London. It feels kind of like almost like magical realism. It's London, but with fantastical elements and locations within the city that don't actually exist. So again, it's not meant to be taken seriously. Like, this is just fun. And so Emma, she comes back to London, and both of her parents had passed away, and so she has to live with this cousin Archibald, who is basically preventing her from accessing any funds, and they live together in this home, hate each other's guts, and Emma is just documenting the really entertaining things that she gets up to and that happen in her little town. And she loves to read, but because she doesn't have money, she's not really able to afford any books. So through the first 3 volumes, her book collection is very, very slowly growing, and I love that so much. And we also have her next door neighbor, who is this dreamy man, and his name is Niall Pierce, and he's this photographer, and they get to know each other a little more, and it's just so much fun. There's really not much else I can say about this book, but if you've read the first volume and you liked it and you're just not sure if you want to continue the series, I do encourage you to try at least volume 2. It does get better, and we learn a lot more of Emma, and it's just such a good time. That's what the series is. It's a good time, full of laugh out loud moments, and the ending of this story, there is a ball that happens, and it was so magical. It's just, oh my gosh, I loved it so much. That is Emma M. Lyon Volume 3. I do have 5 more stories to talk about, technically 4. One of them is the long narrative poem by Tennyson, and I will first mention the 4-star, and then I have 3 of the stories that are kind of, I don't know how I would rank them, but then I will finish off with my favorite read of the month. I read Snow and Rose by Emily Winfield Martin, and it's a very, very sweet fairy tale retelling. It's middle grade. I'm just going to quickly read the summary for this one. It says, Snow and Rose didn't know they were in a fairy tale. People never do. Once, they lived in a big house with spectacular gardens and an army of servants. Once, they had a father and mother who loved them more than the sun and moon. But that was before their father disappeared into the woods, and their mother disappeared into sorrow. This is the story of 2 sisters and the enchanted woods that have been waiting for them to break a set of terrible spells. This was such a cozy story, and I love the woodland ambience so much. I love stories set in forests, and this was the perfect time of year to read it as well. The entire story wasn't all wintry, but it's just the perfect winter read. I loved how the sisterhood was portrayed between Snow and Rose. They were both very different, but I love sisterhood in stories so much. They have this little friend named Evo, and he was adorable as well, or Ivo, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but absolutely adorable. And so these girls are just trying to figure out why their father went missing, and some magical things are going on in the woods, and there's this evil elf-like creature, and it was just so fun. I think this is such a fun fairy tale retelling. I would have loved this so much as a kid. The illustrations were also beautiful. I loved the illustrations so much. Such wonderful art, and I gave this one 4 stars. I thought it was very, very sweet. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Princess from Tennyson's major works. That is the long narrative poem that I read, and it is long. It is very, very long. It took me quite a while to read it, but I loved it. It was so, so good. It is, I'm not sure the name for this type of narrative poem where there's no rhyme. So Wikipedia says it is a serio-comic blank verse narrative poem. I need to learn more about poetry and the types of structures you can find within poetry and all of that. I just wanted to read the opening to the prologue. I just love how summary it is. It is this family, so it's a story within a story, and this family is gathering for this summer feast outside in the Victorian era, and then we have one of the people invited to this gathering. They're asked to tell a story, and then we get the story. But it starts off like this. Sir Walter Vivian all a summer's day gave his broad lawns until the set of sun up to the people. Thither flocked at noon his tenants, wife and child, and thither half the neighbouring borough with their institute of which he was the patron. I was there from college visiting the son, a Walter too. With others of our set, 5 others, we were 7 at Vivian Place. And so this friend of Walter's is just exploring the Vivian home and all the things that they have. And just the descriptions are so summery and idyllic and beautiful. And then Walter tells his friend, "Come out," he said, "to the Abbey. There is Aunt Elizabeth and Sister Lilia with the rest." We went down through the park. Strange was the sight to me, for all the sloping pasture murmured, sown with happy faces and with holiday. And he's just outlining what he is seeing as he's walking. A fire balloon rose gem-like up before the dusky groves and dropped a fairy parachute and passed. Babies rolled about like tumbled fruit in grass, and men and maids arranged a country dance and flew through light and shadow, while the twangling violin struck up with Soldier Laddie, and overhead the broad ambrosial aisles of lofty lime made noise with bees and breeze from end to end. And then the sister of Walter, her name is Lilia, she says, "Oh, I wish that I were some great princess. I would build far off from men a college like a man's, and I would teach them all that men are taught. We are twice as quick." And so that line is the inspiration for this guest, and he is asked to tell a story. And he tells a story of such a college where it is only women, no men are allowed, but there is a prince who was betrothed to this princess since they were children. She starts this university and swears off all contact with men, but he really wants to meet her, and so he disguises himself as a woman and enters the university with a couple of his friends. And there is a lot of havoc that ensues, and it is just so much fun, but also raises a lot of really interesting themes. And I wish that I read this with someone to kind of talk about what Tennyson was trying to say, because some people take this poem as Tennyson mocking people who lean more towards feminism, and then some people take this poem as Tennyson criticizing people who were anti, women's education and all of that. So there's just a lot of interesting things that can be gleaned from this poem, and I would love to reread it at some point and maybe discuss it with some of you if any of you want to read it maybe later this year. But I so enjoyed The Princess, some of the most beautiful writing ever. I loved it so much. But that was The Princess by Tennyson. Alrighty, so next up is a book that I started in December and finished in January, and I'm still in disbelief that I finished the series, and I'm talking about The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. This is the 6th and final story within the Barsetshire series, and how bittersweet to finish a series like this. I just still feel so attached to the characters. I'm currently reading my very first standalone by Anthony Trollope, Ralph the Heir. So the only books I had ever read by him before starting Ralph the Heir were this series. I have not read anything else by him, but just reading the series already affirmed to me that he is a favorite Victorian writer. I adore his writing. I adore his characterization. He is just wonderful. Oh my goodness, the way that he brings characters to life. And a lot of the time I don't even realize just how attached I'm getting to these characters until I finish the story, and then I'm sad because I want to come back and spend more time with these characters, and that's how I felt finishing up this story. I did end up giving it 4 stars. It was not my favorite in the series, and I think I did have a ranking here. So my very favorite in the series was Framley Parsonage, 5 out of 5 stars. Adored that book so much. Dr. Thorne I also adored. And then this one I would say is my 3rd favorite. And then The Small House at Allington, The Wharton, and Barchester Towers was my least favorite. But I just, oh my goodness, I loved this. The first half I really struggled with the pacing, but the second half really made up for it. Just so many emotional roller coasters, and I was really distraught when I finished this book, mainly because of what happens with one of the characters, Johnny Eames, who is one of my favorite characters in this entire series, and I'm still not happy with how his story ends, but I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to spoil anything. And the main plot line, of course, there are multiple plot lines running through the story, as is usual with Trollope, but the main plot line, we have Josiah Crawley, who is another favorite character, and he is this poor clergyman who is a father and a husband, and he's accused of stealing a check to pay off his debts. And he doesn't even really remember how he came about having this check in his possession, and he's also a very proud man, and he doesn't want to seek legal counsel, and things just are insane. Things really go downhill for him and his family. His daughter Grace is in love with this man, Major Grantley, and his parents are not okay with, you know, Major Grantley and Grace wanting to get married because of the scandal surrounding what happened with her father. So that is a whole other issue there. And then we have a whole host of characters, most of whom were introduced in all 5 previous novels. And so all their stories kind of come to an end in this story, and Trollope like ties up loose strings and he just brings everything together so perfectly. And all of these characters that we have grown to either love or hate, or not really know how we feel about them in all the previous novels, they're kind of torn. Some of them are staunchly against Josiah Crawley and believe that he did steal that check. And then some of them, they support him. They're not quite sure what is going on. They think maybe he's a little crazy. Maybe he's, you know, lost his mind a little bit. There's just so much drama because of this. And there's a lot of tension just because the trial for Josiah Crawley is fast approaching, and his family, his wife, his daughter, they're kind of at a loss of what to do to help him. And yeah, the story is just, it's a roller coaster, especially the second half. I really, really, really enjoyed seeing Josiah's character develop throughout the story. He is generally a very morose man, not the happiest of people, but he is known to be hardworking and loves his family and loves his job and really cares about his position as a clergyman, as a curate in the church. I also adore his wife. She is definitely more of the quiet type, but she has such an inner strength. Like, what a strong woman, and a faithful and loyal woman, just standing by his side through everything that he went through. And Grace as well, his daughter, just such a beautiful soul. There were these other 2 characters introduced, these 2 sisters. I believe their names were Miss Prettyman, and I do wish we got more of them. They were there and then they kind of like disappeared for a little bit, and then they come back later in the story. But I really, really enjoyed them, and I wish we got more of them. In the small house at Allington, we're introduced to Lily Dale and Johnny Eames, and they're very important characters in this book as well. Johnny meets this woman named Madalena Demoline, and she was terrible. This woman, oh my goodness, I literally could not stand her, but she was so fun to despise. I really, really enjoyed seeing how that story went and played out. Mr. and Mrs. Dobbs Broughton are also really interesting characters, and then we have Conway Dalrymple, who was such an interesting man. He's also an artist, and he meets this woman, Clara Van Siever, and things kind of happen in their lives, and it's absolutely insane. And Lily Dale is friends with Grace, so we get to see more of Lily as well, and I really enjoyed that. But like I said, this book was an emotional roller coaster, and I still don't know how I feel about certain things that happened at the end and how Johnny Eames' story played out. I'm not really happy with that. Lily Dale, I found Lily to be one of the most exasperating characters I've ever come across, even though I also really, really love her as a character. But I am just so glad that I read this series and have realized just how amazing Anthony Trollope is, and he is definitely the writer for me. I love his works so much, and I definitely shed a tear or 2 when I read the very, very last paragraph of this story. This doesn't spoil anything, but it just goes to show how much Anthony Trollope himself loved these characters. He spent so much time creating this county and writing these characters and making them so unique with their own voices, and just so many different characters that really, really stood out. And this is the last paragraph. It made me tear up. And this is what it says. "And now, if the reader will allow me to seize him affectionately by the arm, we will together take our last farewell of Barset and of the towers of Barchester. I may not venture to say to him that, in this county, he and I together have wandered often through the country lanes, and have ridden together over the 2 well-wooded fields, or have stood together in the cathedral, listening to the peals of the organ, or have together sat at good men's tables, or have confronted together the angry pride of men who were not good. I may not boast that any beside myself have so realized the place, and the people, and the facts, as to make such reminiscences possible as those which I should attempt to evoke by an appeal to perfect fellowship. But to me Barset has been a real county, and its city a real city, and the spires and towers have been before my eyes, and the voices of the people are known to my ears, and the pavement of the city ways are familiar to my footsteps, that I have been induced to wander among them too long by my love of old friendships, and by the sweetness of old faces, is a fault for which I may perhaps be more readily forgiven, when I repeat with some solemnity of assurance the promise made in my title that this shall be the last chronicle of Barset." I'm so sad it's over, but oh my goodness, what a series. such a wonderful series. I have 2 more books to talk about, both of which were definite highlights of January for me. I just loved these books so much. Next up is The Young Stepmother by Charlotte Mary Yonge, and this is my 4th book by this author. And I just fall in love more and more with her writing as I read more from her. I actually read this with a group with Kate Howe and a couple other friends, Elizabeth and Libby, and they all gave this book 5 stars. For me, I landed on like 4.5, 4.75. It's almost the perfect 5-star read. There were just 1 or 2 things that kind of brought it down just a little bit for me, but still such a wonderful story. And days after finishing it, I just keep thinking about our main character. I cannot stop thinking about her. She was fantastic. So our main character, her name is Albinia, and she marries this widower. He has 3 children, and the story is basically about her adjusting to her new life as a stepmother. She's quite young as well. She's in her early 20s when she marries Mr. Kendall, and his children are all kind of in the preteen age range. And so she marries Mr. Kendall. He's a wonderful man. She is such a wonderful woman. Albinia has such a big heart and a almost like larger than life persona. She is just so content and willing to put in the hard work to be the best mother that she can be to these children, and it was so refreshing to read that. It was so beautiful. And she's also trying to understand these children's struggles and their own trauma, losing their mother and multiple siblings to illness, and their own struggles to accept Albinia as their stepmother. And the 3 children are Sophie, Lucy, and Gilbert. The story is just so complex, and these characters are so complex, and there's just so many emotional complexities to all of these characters. I loved seeing the character growth, especially with Mr. Kendall and a couple of his children. Mr. Kendall in particular, he starts off as kind of standoffish. He's very kind, but he's very much introverted, keeps to himself, kind of locks himself away in his library just with his books and his learning, and he doesn't really involve himself in his children's lives. It's really interesting to see how that changes, especially after Albinia delivers their child, her first child, basically, little Maurice. He is basically like the gentleman within his village, and he has a lot of tenants, and he doesn't really do much for his community. He's really isolating himself and everything, and of course, we see how his character changes. This story is really about family dynamics. It is a domestic novel, a bit of sentimentality, but also very, very realistic. And I really, really appreciated how Charlotte Mary Yonge explored mental health and depression in particular in a young teen girl. One of the daughters, Sophie, she definitely struggles with her mental health. And it's so rare to see in Victorian literature this kind of depth in exploring mental health, and just seeing how Albinia and Mr. Kendall, or Edmund, the parents, how they're trying to understand Sophie, and they have these like warring thoughts about why she is the way she is, why she acts the way she acts, and they want to be the best parents they can be. They want to help her. They don't always make the best decisions, and sometimes things backfire, and it's just so realistic, and I could relate to Sophie as someone who really, really struggled with deep depression around her age. And oh my goodness, it was a breath of fresh air almost to just read this type of realistic family story where real things happen and loss happens, and people are trying to battle their grief, and oh my goodness, I loved it so much. It was so wonderful. Charlotte Mary Yonge was a very religious woman, so a lot of faith is woven throughout the story, a lot with like the high church, and there's talk of confirmation, and one of the characters goes through confirmation, and I just thought that was really interesting. I don't know too much about the high church, the Anglican church, so that was really, really fascinating to read. I just can't get over how perfectly realistic the story was. We have Gilbert, one of the children, who as a teenager, he kind of has this crush on a woman, and she's just a little bit older than him, and it's just kind of like that young puppy love, and oh my goodness, it was so realistic, and the way that his parents were trying to figure out how to navigate this. And we also get to see very mundane things like home renovations and things that don't seem to be all that interesting, but I love seeing things that feel so relatable in a Victorian novel. And then we have conversations where the kids are trying to figure out like what their futures are going to look like, and there are weddings and outdoor picnics and frolics and fun and even fireworks, and it was just such a wonderful book, so wonderful. We also have this vicar, Mr. Dusatoy, and his wife Fanny, and they were 2 of my favorite characters. Such pure-hearted people, the biggest hearts, and just so beautiful. You know what? I am going to change my rating to 5 stars. This is a 5-star read. It's not a 4.5-star read. It's a 5-star read. Just thinking about it, sitting here and reflecting, it's a book that's really sticking with me. I think part of the reason why I initially landed on 4.5 stars, it was just, I struggled a bit with the pacing. I struggled a bit in the fact that I got so behind in the buddy read, and then I was trying to catch up and just kind of reading a lot more than I was in the mood for certain days. But I mean, I can't stop thinking about this book. I'm changing it to 5 stars. So that is The Young Stepmother by Charlotte Mary Yonge, and I do have one more book to talk about. And now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like The Young Stepmother was probably my favorite read of January, so I'm technically ending off with my second favorite read. But I feel kind of weird saying this next book is a favorite because it was so terribly depressing. That is Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. I have never read a book by Edith Wharton before. This is my first by her. And I read this book for Anne's Read the Classics challenge. I mentioned that the other 2 scavenger hunt items were a male protagonist and Wintery, and like Wintery descriptions. And this is one of the most Wintery books I've ever read. I don't know how well you can see, but I have a lot of blue tabs, and the blue tabs are all just Wintery descriptions, and I loved it so much. This is such a short piece of fiction. Like, you could read this in one sitting. It is very, very short. So in this story, we have an unnamed narrator, and he is telling the story as he has learned it about Ethan and his story and why he is the way he is. Because initially when he met Ethan Frome, he could tell that there was some sort of disability, like he was limping and he had been in some accident. So he's learning about Ethan and his wife's cousin who was living with them at the time. Ethan, he lives on this farm. He's a very lonely and depressed man. He doesn't get out. He doesn't talk to people. He's just very, very isolated. And he lives on this farm with his wife, Zena. When they were younger, Zena had a cousin move in with them named Maddie, and she moved in to help Zena around the house because she was very sickly and needed the help and everything. And so we learned about these 3 main characters, and things got insane. Very, very crazy, very quickly. It says, in its unyielding and shocking pessimism, its bleak demonstration of tragic waste, it's a masterpiece of psychological and emotional realism. It's one of those stories that people often say is like a train wreck where you can't look away, and it's just so, so depressing. Like, there is nothing happy about this book. Nothing. It is not the type of book you want to read if you need happy endings, if you need some sort of ray of hope in the way that other books are. Like, even Wuthering Heights, one of the most depressing stories I've ever read, but the ending, there's kind of a spark of hope there. Not with this book at all. But I have to say, the writing is some of the best writing I've ever come across. It is not overly wordy, but it is so beautifully descriptive at the same time. Every single word is intentional. Every single sentence is placed perfectly. Like, not one word is wasted in this book. It is just perfection in the way it's written. I finished this and I just felt so, so heavy in my soul, and truly was reflecting, and I'm just so grateful for the hope that I do have, because I could not live life if this is the kind of life I had to live the way that Ethan is living it. And he is a really, really fascinating character, very unlikable. So is his wife Zena. Very, very unlikable people, and they make decisions that have very dire consequences, and you do feel sympathy. Some people may not, reading Ethan's story. I felt a spark of sympathy for him, but at the same time, you know the saying, when you make your bed, you have to lie in it type of thing. I don't want to say what he does, but consequences. At the very beginning of the story, there's just the description of the setting and Ethan, and it's just so, so tangible. Ethan Frome drove in silence, the reins loosely held in his left hand, his brown-seamed profile under the helmet-like peak of the cap, relieved against the banks of snow like the bronze image of a hero. He never turned his face to mine or answered except in monosyllables the questions I put, or such slight pleasantries as I ventured. He seemed a part of the mute, melancholy landscape, an incarnation of its frozen woe, with all that was warm and sentient in him fast bound below the surface, but there was nothing unfriendly in his silence. I simply felt that he lived in a depth of moral isolation too remote for casual access, and I had the sense that his loneliness was not merely the result of his personal plight, tragic as I guessed that to be, but had in it, as Harman Gow had hinted, the profound accumulated cold of many Starkfield winters. And the cold and the snow, it definitely also felt like a character, like such a strong presence in the story. And it's like Ethan's life was a constant, long, depressing winter without end. And I love the name of the town, Starkfield. It just has that essence as well. And then at some point, Ethan has to bring this unnamed narrator to his house because they would have gotten stuck in the snowstorm. And it says, "That's my place," said Frome, with a sideway jerk of his lame elbow, and in the distress and oppression of the scene, I did not know what to answer. The snow had ceased, and a flash of watery sunlight exposed the house on the slope above us in all its plaintive ugliness. The black wraith of a deciduous creeper flapped from the porch, and the thin wooden walls, under their worn coat of paint, seemed to shiver in the wind that had risen with the ceasing of the snow. I mentioned that Ethan's wife, Zena, has a cousin that comes and lives with them, Maddie, and she is really the only ray of light within Starkfield and within Ethan's life, and he's so drawn to that, and they kind of form a very strong emotional connection. And there's that danger of infidelity, and that's not a spoiler, like this is a huge thing in this story, a huge plot point, and we start to see evidence of that very early in the story. I really truly detest reading about infidelity. That's something I just don't like at all. And I will say though, it's in stories like these that I really appreciate how the author explores those themes. And it's in stories like Anna Karenina, and the author is not excusing any of the actions taken by these characters. But it's so interesting to see, like, because of Ethan's, I guess, melancholy nature and unhappy marriage and just unhappy life in general, and his inability to find joy in anything around him, he's so attracted to what Maddie provides and who Maddie is and her love of life and all of that. And it's very dangerous. And oh my goodness, the story is absolutely nuts. Just another passage that, oh my goodness, like the writing is just perfection. He looked out at the slopes bathed in luster, the silver-edged darkness of the woods, the spectral purple of the hills against the sky, and it seemed as though all the beauty of the night had been poured out to mock his wretchedness. A red sun stood out over the gray rim of the fields, behind trees that looked black and brittle. This book was not an easy read. It was heavy, it was depressing, and very bleak, but I'm so glad that I read it, and I did give it 5 stars. I could not give it any lower. Like, it was just such an impactful story, gripping, and I was very engaged in the reading process. Even though none of it was happy, it was still such a poignant read and fascinating. So that is Ethan Frome, and this is actually the last book that I finished in January. And even though it was a slumpy month, I'm still really happy with what I did manage to read in this month. But friends, that is it for this wrap up. That's it for my January reads, and I would love to know what you read in January as well. And if you've read any of the books I talked about, please let me know what you thought of them. If any of these are books you also enjoyed or didn't enjoy, I would love to continue chatting in the comments below. But friends, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.